worked as hard as their friends. They were also working like a team, and as they fought, both of them showed the increased power they had attained after Brock joined in on Ash's training program. While Brock's Graveler was a lot like Giselle's in that it made solid use of its brute force, powerful strength and rock-solid form, his Zubat was more like Misty's Staryu. Even though his only flying-type Pokémon was going up against several other Zubat and even Golbat, it was easy to see from any point of view that Brock's was far superior in terms of training and technique. All the other Zubat and Golbat were far sloppier and much less graceful in the air, but since Brock's was used to flying around in the heavy body weights that Ash's training routinely called for, it made him look like a speeding Pidgeot amongst sleeping Slowpoke. When one or even a few of his pre-evolved cousins got close, Zubat would simply speed elegantly around them and then come in from another angle to strike one. Doing so by either using his wings, body mass or air attacks. Even the Golbat couldn't hope to catch up to, no less beat, the smaller bat Pokémon. If he was able to put his fellow Zubat to shame by flying circles around them, he made the heavier and more awkward Golbat look like grounded Caterpie. Aside from flying in, out and around them and leaving the Rocket's Golbat dizzy from trying to keep up, he also succeeded in causing some of them to attack each other. When one or more would get close enough to attack, he would simply veer away like a blue blur and leave the assaulting Golbat to either smash into or hit one another with their own aerial attacks. Of course, even though smaller, Brock's Zubat was also able to take his bigger kin by surprise more than once and managed to smash his compact, speeding self into their backs, sides or midsection at random intervals. Or even strike one with a quick but effective move like Wing Attack or a well-placed and nasty bite. Thus, while Brock and Misty's two Graveler worked like steamrollers to decimate the enemy forces in large swaths, especially when using the nigh unstoppable rollout, Zubat caused their aerial foes to drop like stones to the ground. One after the other. Marowak, Starmie and Staryu obviously had their own important roles to play as well, since, no matter what rocket Pokémon came up against them, they merely cut down said foes quickly with what would have looked like genuine ease to anyone observing from the outside. While the battle raged on atop the elevated island that Articuno's nest resided on and multiple attacks were thrown back and forth amongst both groups of viciously fighting Pokémon, Ash's one and only fighter was easily holding his own by himself. It seemed as though all the rest of the small army of rocket Pokémon had decided to converge upon Haunter, but the comparison was as a giant being attacked by tiny little insects. Without any effort or strain on his own part, the powerful ghost type was able to simply float in one place and fight the enemies rushing at him. Using his strong psychic abilities, Haunter easily captured several of them at one time in an unbreakable telekinetic grip and then either tossed them away or bashed them against the ground and into unconsciousness. Those he didn't grab with his psychic power he was able to just as easily put down by firing off one of his strong ghost-type attacks. Such as Nightshade or Shadow Ball. Ghoulish, energy-based attacks that were so large and powerful, they were able to take out multiple opponents in one shot. The battle was fierce and the fighting intense, but it was short-lived to be sure. In only a matter of minutes, all the rocket grunts were left gaping in shock and even fear as all of their Pokémon were soon left laying in unconscious and utterly beaten heaps. With Ash and his friends' Pokémon all standing tall and strong, Cassidy and Butch could only stare in disbelief. "No way. That can't possible," the green-haired man yelled in vehement denial. Cassidy's shock, however, quickly turned to anger as she growled. "You meddlesome and foolish little pests. I am going to make you regret the day that you ever crossed paths with us." She then pulled out a Pokeball from a deep pocket in the thick winter coat she was wearing and shot a look at her partner. "Well, don't just stand there like an idiot. Help me." Snapping to attention, he quickly nodded and took out a Pokeball himself. "Right. With that, she looked back at the children opposing them and smirked. "We'll show you brats never to mess with Team Rocket." She then tossed her Pokeball and yelled, "Tentacruel. Goo." In a burst of bright light and stars, the evolved and multi-tentacled cousin of Tentacool appeared on the snow-covered ground. Butch soon followed suit by smirking and flipping his hair. "All right. Let's show these upstart brats what real power is all about." The ball he threw soon snapped open and out came the heavily shelled, evolved form of Shelder. Its small, round, black face was leering and grinning in that atypical way of its species, and it quickly took a position next to Tentacruel. As the rest of the beaten Team Rocket grunts returned their defeated Pokémon to clear the way, Misty suddenly stepped forward and spoke seriously. "You boys leave this to me. I want to see just how far me and my Pokémon have come." She then looked at Giselle and smirked through her mask, though no one could see it. "You wanna help me? It'd be like our battle against those rich girls back in Saffron City and the other one we had." Respecting that Misty had been mindful enough not to use her name, the brunette nodded back and smiled, even though it too couldn't be seen. "Yeah, let's show how far we've come since we started training so hard." Ash and Brock merely shared a look between them and then nodded before stepping back and ordering their Pokémon to back away as well. With the decision made, Giselle chose Marowak to battle for her while Misty called both Starmie and Staryu back and pulled out another ball. "I need to get this handsome little guy some more battle experience, so." She smiled and then tossed the Pokeball out that she had in hand. "Tentacool, go." With both girls' Pokémon chosen, Butch and Cassidy shared a condescending laugh. "Well, this will be over quickly." The mint-haired man added to his female companion's jibe. "Once we crush them, we'll toss these annoying kids into the icy water and take their Pokémon for ourselves." Cassidy smiled in a twisted manner. "Agreed. Now Tentacruel, use Bubble Beam." Butch followed suit by yelling, "Cloyster, use Water Gun." Their Pokémon demonstrated that at least they were better trained and more adept than the ones belonging to the nameless rocket grunts. This came in the form of both attacks being quickly executed and sent speeding toward their targets. However, Misty and Giselle were already prepared and ordered their Pokémon to quickly get out of the way, which they did so swiftly. Marowak jumped out of the way of the blast of water, and Tentacool showed surprising speed by leaping to the side with his two tentacles and avoiding the spray of bubbles that had been coming his way. Now Marowak used Bonemerang. Giselle commanded while Misty followed suit. Tentacool used Poison Sting. Both of their Pokémon executed their attacks quickly, but Cloyster merely snapped its shell closed and caused the Bone Club to hammer off of it harmlessly. Tentacruel, meanwhile, easily parried the attack of its younger kin by using the same one to cancel it out. Use Focus Energy and charge Cloyster. Giselle wasn't about to let the failure of one attack stop her from making another. Misty wasn't either, since she commanded firmly. Now Tentacool used Supersonic. As Marowak took off running at his opponent while cinching up on the Bone Club now back in his hands, he chanted his name and began glowing red in a sign that his internal energy was building. Tentacool did the same as the small red gem in the center of his forehead gleamed and sent several concentric rings of sonic energy at his evolved opponent. However, neither Cassidy or Butch looked bothered by the incoming assault, since the latter merely smirked. "Guess we'll have to show them the hard way, huh, Cass?" "It would be my pleasure," she responded arrogantly. When Marowak got in close to Cloyster, he raised his now glowing red club and, with a bellow, started raining it down upon the hard shell of his opponent, whom had withdrawn into its shell yet again before the first hit could even land. Simultaneously, the rings of yellow sound waves quickly reached Tentacruel, but the effort was for naught. On Cassidy's command, her Pokémon used Screech and emitted an ear-splitting shrieking noise, whose own sound waves cancelled out those of Supersonic. At the same time, while Marowak was bashing away at Cloyster's shell, Butch gave an order with a smirk still plastered on his face. Cloyster used Spike Cannon. Opening its impenetrable shell just as Marowak was about to thrash his club against the hard surface again, Cloyster's grinning face appeared just as his rounded, dark-colored head glowed. Then, before Marowak could react, Cloyster fired a vicious assault of dozens of sharp energy needles at him. Not prepared for the sudden counterattack, Giselle's Pokémon took the full brunt and went flying back through the air, landing with a hard thud onto the snow-covered ground several feet away. As soon as this happened, Cassidy raised her hand and laughed in cruel amusement. Tentacruel used Acid and then Hydro Pump. From the blue jellyfish's mouth was spat a glob of thick, purple acid that Tentacool had to lunge to the side to avoid. Tentacruel followed that up immediately, though by firing off a powerful and torrent-like blast of water from its mouth. This ended up being too fast in coming for Tentacool to avoid, and thus, the two-tentacled Pokémon was sent careening back across the white powdered, rocky platform. The water blast he was caught in threw him far back and almost right next to Marowak. Ash and Brock grimaced as they saw this, but the two rocket commanders only grinned in perverse joy and cackled in boastful amusement. Misty and Giselle, to their credit though, remained calm under the tense moment of the stressful situation. Tentacruel. Make that little bone-loving loser of a Pokémon feel the wrath of its superiors. Use Hydro Pump. Just as her Pokémon did as commanded and launched its high-powered water attack at Marowak, Butch ordered Cloyster to use Spike Cannon again, this time on Tentacool. However, just before the blast of water could strike Giselle's Pokémon, whom was just starting to stand back up, Tentacool performed an unexpected maneuver that surprised everyone watching. Rolling up into what would be considered as a standing position for it, Tentacool lunged at Marowak and wrapped his two tentacles around his battling partner. Then, with a hard jerk backwards, he tossed Marowak behind him and out of the way of the powerful water jet while Tentacool himself fell back. This, luckily, caused Hydro Pump to pass right over top of him as well. It was at that same parallel moment in time, unfortunately, that Cloyster took aim at the now unprepared Tentacool and finally fired a volley of sharp needles at him. It seemed, initially, that Misty's Pokémon was about to sustain the full brunt of the attack. However, just before they could hit, Marowak suddenly jumped in front of Tentacool with his bone club raised in front of him. Then, at fast speeds, he started twirling it in hand like it was an industrial fan. This incredibly fast rotational pattern made all of the poisonous barbs impact against the solid bone and bounce off, causing the sound of loud pinging to fill the chilly airspace. Thanks for the help, Misty said gratefully as she looked over at the brunette after Marowak saved her Pokémon. No problem. The chocolate-eyed beauty responded back with a smile. That's what friends are for, right? Cassidy curled her lip up in disgust. Enough with the cutesy friendship crap. This is a battle, not a filthy love circle. After that, she snarled a bitter command to her Pokémon. Tentacruel, use Poison Jab on that weak little Tentacool. Butch gave her backup by calling out in his gravelly tone to Cloyster. Use Withdraw and then Tackle. As both rocket Pokémon took off in a fast charge at Tentacool and Marowak, Cloyster withdrawing into its shell and taking off in a rapid spin while Tentacruel sped forward with a single raised tentacle that was glowing a toxic purple. Misty and Giselle both shared a look between them. What say we work together? Giselle smirked, which was returned by Misty as she nodded. You read my mind. The former Cerulean City gym leader looked to her Pokémon then and held out her hand. Tentacool. Wrap your tentacles around Marowak and then toss him. Knowing that he could trust the other Pokémon he trained and worked with on a regular basis, Marowak allowed Tentacool to wrap his tentacles around his body. Then, with a fast, 360 spin in place and a surprisingly hard toss, the jellyfish Pokémon launched Marowak across the length of the big, icy rock that held Articuno's nest. However, instead of tossing him at Tentacruel, whom was closer, he threw Marowak at Cloyster, the heavily fortified Pokémon still spinning fast through the air while tucked tightly into its shell. The toss was powerful enough that it defeated the rate of speed Tentacruel had been approaching its pre-evolved cousin at, which meant Marowak reached Cloyster first. This also meant that, because Butch's Pokémon was elevated a short ways off the ground while spinning through the air, Marowak passed right underneath of his opponent. Just as he came within an almost direct line of Cloyster's midsection while sliding underneath of it, Marowak put his bone club behind him and used it as a springboard. This launched the ground type straight up into Cloyster's bottom half with both feet and launched the evolved form of Shelder straight up into the air. Immediately after doing this, Marowak narrowed his eyes up at his now skyward bound opponent and tensed his legs before jumping up after it. Within seconds, Giselle's Pokémon was level with Cloyster up in the air. Due to the sudden dramatic shift of now being airborne, the shelled Pokémon opened itself up, only to see Marowak looking at it. Cloyster only had enough time to widen its eyes in surprise before Marowak turned in midair and smashed his club into the side of his enemy's hard shell. The force and effect of the hit was immediate. Due to the strength with which Marowak hit it, Cloyster went spinning back down towards the ground at a fast rate of speed. Yet, unfortunately for Tentacruel, that trajectory was perfectly in line with its own planned path of attack concerning Tentacool. Because of this, Cloyster ended up providing for both of them a nasty surprise as it slammed into Tentacruel and knocked both of them completely off course and straight into the snow-covered ground. As the two Pokémon hit the snowy terrain and skidded across its surface, one atop the other, Giselle and Misty both cheered. "Alright. Nice one." Ash's girlfriend complimented passionately. The red-haired girl looked at her only female friend and winked. "Watch this then." She focused on Tentacool afterwards and then flicked her eyes toward the now jumbled up rocket Pokémon. "We need to make this count, Tentacool. Time to show Tentacruel that evolution doesn't matter." The youngest of the sensational sisters then clenched her right fist. "Get in closer and use Poison Sting." Giselle followed suit behind Misty and also issued a command. Marowak followed Tentacool and used Bonemerang on Cloyster. At once, both Pokémon took off across the icy and snowy ground toward Butch and Cassidy's Pokémon. Unfortunately for the aforementioned rockets, however, Tentacruel and Cloyster were still laying jumbled up together on the ground. Quite literally too, since the former's tentacles were wrapped around the latter's shell like a knotted-up ball of string. Being that Tentacruel was presently defenseless with no use of its tentacles, Cloyster was the only one capable of doing anything. Realizing this, Butch growled in frustration. "Cloyster, use Ice Beam and stop those annoying little runts." Having had its shell open ever since getting tossed into Tentacruel, Cloyster saw Tentacool and Marowak getting close to them. So, feeling a sense of urgency, it quickly formed a beam of ice between its shell that it prepared to shoot at them. Giselle was quick-witted though, because she called out in a hasty rush. "Marowak, get Tentacool wrapped around your club and then toss him at Tentacruel." Misty's face morphed into an expression of surprise for a moment, but she quickly fell in step with Giselle's plan and turned her attention forward again. "You heard her, Tentacool. Wrap your tentacles around Marowak's club." Without breaking their headlong rush, Marowak dropped his club down in front of Tentacool and, leaping forward without stopping, the water type jumped onto it and curled himself around the long bone with his tentacles. All this happened in seconds, and just as Cloyster prepared to shoot the beam of ice, Marowak reared back while running and then threw his bone club that had Tentacool wrapped around it at Tentacruel, giving a loud whack as he made the throw. His toss was much like one who threw a javelin, and that meant Tentacool went speeding in a straight line toward Tentacruel. At that same moment, Cloyster fired its ice beam attack at Marowak since Tentacool was now out of range. However, the tide had turned. Without breaking stride, Marowak narrowed his eyes at the incoming beam of ice and then, just before it could hit him, he powerfully leapt straight up into the air, avoiding the icy attack by mere seconds. In tandem with his leap, Tentacool had reached his evolved cousin via the bone club he was still wrapped around. Thus, as soon as it reached Tentacruel, not only did it hit Cassidy's Pokémon in the head, but Tentacool jumped off and latched itself onto the bigger Pokémon, using his two tentacles to wrap himself tightly around the other jellyfish's face like a squishy living mask. At this time, Marowak's club was circling up through the air and, while he was in midair still, it flew back and landed perfectly in his hand. This came just at the right moment because, while clear of Ice Beam, Marowak wasn't done yet. While he was still airborne several feet above the elevated island, Giselle's loyal loner Pokémon raised his club into the air and then tossed it earthward with a heavy grunt. A sound in which demonstrated the force with which he had tossed the weaponized bone. Cloyster looked up and saw this, but, just as it went to tuck back into its shell for safety, the club ended up getting stuck in between both sides of the shelled Pokémon, right in the midst of Cloyster being mere seconds away from fully snapping itself closed. Finding itself unable to close its shell due to the extremely dense, calcified bone club that was now stuck in the top of its shell, like a wrench in the middle of two gears, Cloyster struggled and strained with all of its might to shut its shell. Though each attempt was for naught. Landing on the ground only a few feet from Cloyster, Marowak was on his enemy with eyes narrowed behind his skull cap just as Giselle smirked and yelled out. Marowak used rage and let Cloyster have it. In mid-run, the ground type started to growl under his breath as his whole body became suffused by a bright red glow. Then, with a strong forward leap, he actually jumped straight inside of Cloyster's pried open shell and landed right in front of the heavily armored Pokémon's small, circular, black inner body. The typically smirking face of Cloyster was instead turned to fear and distress as Marowak, with an angry bellow, commenced to brutalizing the weak, delicate and defenseless inner parts of Cloyster. Utilizing an all-out savage onslaught of claw swipes, headbutts and even forceful jumping kicks. Butch, who by now had wide eyes and a stunned expression upon his formerly smirking face, yelled irritably. Cloyster, what are you doing? Get out of there. Don't let that little wimp do that to you. The assault continued on Misty's end too, and she gave an order to Tentacool, whom was still holding tightly to Tentacool's face and refusing to let go. Tentacool. Use acid and shoot it into Tentacool's face. Looking his evolved form straight in the eyes, Tentacool built up a gooey discharge of purple, acidic waste and then shot it straight into Tentacool's face from his mouth, which was located just underneath his tentacles like all members of the Tenta family. As the thick, goopy substance splashed into Tentacool's face, it also covered his eyes, effectively blinding it and causing the larger jellyfish to begin to panic. And, since Tentacool had finally managed to stand up after getting untangled from Cloyster when Tentacool was launched into it, the larger Pokémon began stumbling backwards. Taking full advantage, Misty gave another order. Tentacool, detach yourself from it and then use Poison Sting and Bubble Beam. Doing as told, her Pokémon released the hold he had on Tentacool's face and landed back down on the ground. Then, in rapid succession, he first used Poison Sting and then Bubble Beam as a double assault on his older cousin. The combination of that attack caused Tentacool to stumble back even more under the heavy assault of both, the poisonous needles, as well as the rapid popping bubbles that soon followed. At that time, Marowak had just finished beating on Cloyster and then leapt out of its mouth, grabbing his bone club along the way and yanking it free with a hard tug. Then, landing on both feet beside the now dazed water type, Giselle's battling partner slammed his club into the side of Cloyster's shell, which sent it rolling towards Tentacool again and smashing into it once more. As Tentacool fell to the snowy ground and Cloyster lay hunkered and beaten up inside of its shell, both girls shared a look and then smiled. You ready to end this? Misty asked with a smirk. You know it, came the other girl's enthusiastic reply. Then, together, they pointed and called out simultaneously. Marowak, Tentacool. Use Bonemerang, Bubble Beam. The two soon-to-be victorious Pokémon quickly executed both attacks. Marowak gave a swift and strong toss of his one and only weapon of choice while Tentacool, beside of him, was just about to perform his own attack. However, right as he was building up the energy needed to expel the voluminous spray of bubbles that Misty had called for, the red gems on Tentacool's head glowed instead. Then, as if his whole body had suddenly become alight with power, Tentacool started to chant his name while narrowing his eyes. Everyone atop the icy platform just stared at Tentacool in wonder, but soon, they all heard the sound of what resembled a great wall of water rushing up. Turning at the sound, Ash and his friend's eyes went wide as they spotted a large wall of icy water that had come from below, now standing tall over their heads. This being a shock that was mimicked by Butch, Cassidy and the rest of the rocket agents around them. Looking back, Misty saw that Tentacool appeared to be controlling the waves since the three gems in his head were still glowing and he appeared to be laser-focused on whatever it was he was doing. Realizing what was happening just as Marowak's thrown bone club struck Cloyster's closed shell and returned back to him, Misty looked back at the wall of water and spoke in awe. I think Tentacool just learned how to use Surf. Giselle nodded in agreement as she too looked at the wall of icy water being held in suspended animation before them. I think you're right. Water-type Pokémon can use Surf in different ways, and I think Tentacool's lower-end psychic abilities just matured enough that it allowed him to subconsciously learn that move. As if to prove the assumption correct, Tentacool suddenly reared up onto both tentacles, raising to his full height, as he chorused out his name and the gems on his head glowed once more. With that single action, the towering wall of icy water came crashing down onto the snowy island that Articuno's nest laid upon. Luckily though, Tentacool was controlling it with his minor psychic abilities, and that caused the wave to arc in a spectacular fashion, like a bridge stretching over the sea, so that it went over the heads of Misty and the others, as well as the nest. Unfortunately for them, Cloyster and Tentacruel were not so lucky. The powerful wave of freezing cold water soon slammed upon the island and did so right on top of the two grounded Pokémon. This completely covered Butch and Cassidy's partners from view and also caused both of them, as well as the rest of the rockets nearby, to run for the farthest cover on the platform. All to avoid getting swept up in the powerful current and knocked down off the island, into the freezing water below. Sadly for Tentacruel and Cloyster, this wasn't the case, and they in fact did end up getting washed off of Articuno's perch and into the underground lake that awaited as retribution for their defeat. Seeing their Pokémon fallen into the chilling waters below, Cassidy and Butch ran up to where they had been swept over the edge. All the while, they stepped upon snowy ground that was now sloshy wet from the fierce and powerful aquatic attack. "No, Tentacruel!" Cassidy yelled in a mixture of shock and anger that her Pokémon had been defeated. From beside of her, the green-haired man merely looked stunned and aghast at the radical turn of events. "Cloyster! How could this happen?" With a growl, the furious blonde returned Tentacruel, whom was now laying unconscious and floating face up in the pristine, below freezing water. Cloyster was bobbing in a similar manner next to it. Turning back around as Butch did the same, the female commander of the operation turned her fierce, dagger-sharp glare onto Misty and Giselle. So furious was she in fact that her other hand had balled up into a fist and shook. You snotty-nosed, bratty, meddlesome and intolerable little worms. I swear you will pay for this. We will destroy you. Slowly make you suffer and then throw you into the waters in this cave so that you can drown and freeze to death while you do so." She and Butch stowed their Pokeballs away as the latter frowned and threatened in his gravelly tone. "You won't beat us that easily." Suddenly, the other rockets all closed in on either side of Butch and Cassidy with a new round of Pokeballs raised. Likewise, the two of them also produced two new balls as well. Smirking, Cassidy gave the young heroes across from them a nasty sneer and then laughed mockingly. "You might have gotten lucky in that battle, but there are far more of us and we have many more Pokémon than the four of you. And now we will show you why you don't mess with Team Rocket. By crushing you with all of our Pokémon at once." Misty and Giselle took a step back with the former sweating nervously. "If we're all gonna have to go through this again, it might not end so well a second time." Giselle nodded in agreement, but, at that moment, Ash and Brock stepped forward again with their own Pokémon moving up to stand in solidarity next to Marowak and Tentacool. "You can do your worst," Ash called out firmly. "As I said before, we won't let you succeed, ever. We'll stand and fight every single Pokémon you have." Brock agreed with a quick head nod. "That's right, you won't beat the four of us working together." Giselle and Misty, their nervousness abated, strengthened their courage and resolve. The brunette clenched her own fists and steeled her fortitude. "We beat you once and we'll do it again." Misty pointed and glared at the large line of rockets. "Yeah, we beat your sorry butts and we'll keep doing it until you finally learn your lesson and leave these caves. You disgusting, sick, twisted freaks." Cassidy sneered again and raised her new Pokeball, an action mimicked by everyone else, including Butch. "Brave words for little wimps that are about to get flattened under the titanic force that is us. Team Rocket." However, just as they were all about to release their Pokémon, everyone in the cavern was stopped by the mysterious and strange sound of what felt like something coming. Something that sounded very big. For several moments, time appeared to pass slowly as both good and bad sides of the current confrontation just listened and looked amongst the cavern for the source of the sound. And as it grew louder, so too grew all of the curious and anxious minds at just what was coming their way. Finally, with a pull in his gut that felt like someone had physically turned him around, Ash slowly spun himself on his feet until he was facing the farthest wall of the cavern, which was on the side that was in correspondence with the back end of the nest. As he did so, his three friends mimicked him and even all the rockets in attendance stared hard in the same direction. All eyes were locked onto a large waterfall at the back of the cavern, one in which fell from partway up the wall and spilled its sub-zero essence into the lake below. With all human and even Pokémon eyes trained on the waterfall, Where the sound was now known to be coming from, there seemed to be but a moment of peace before the falling cascade of water appeared to explode outward. From out of the icy chilled falls emerged a truly mighty shape. A form, a figure in appearance, that seemed to be what one would only see in artistic renderings or in ancient drawings of times long since lost to memory. Majesty was its name, and splendor seemed to radiate from the great living spectacle of wonder that emerged from within the pure, clean falling water. The sight itself, at its immediate presentation, was a mighty sight to behold. Indeed, it seemed not but an illusion. A trick of the eyes or of the light reflecting and casting cruel, false vision upon the human senses. From out of the mighty, thundering falls emerged a great creature, a bird for any lack of a more honorable description. A Pokémon of long since forgotten and distant legend that was claimed to be nothing more than a myth now. The bird was large in size, compared most especially to any normal species of flying type. It had wings that boasted a more than reasonable expanse, and the color of the feathers that adorned it were as the bluest sapphires, they even seemed to gleam. The mighty avian's chest was covered in soft-looking, downy feathers that gleamed like purest snow, and the tail feathers that streamed behind it were like silken blue banners caught high in a morning breeze. Atop its head was a crest of a dark blue tri-shape. It looked to be some form of ice, but that was not its true substance. Though, for all attempted postulations of what it could be made of, no doubts were to be had that the crest seemed to crown the mighty bird. Like the royalty that it in every way appeared to uphold. As the great and mighty bird emerged from within the waterfall and sent water droplets flying in all directions like diamond showers, it flapped its powerful wings once and began soaring throughout the expanse of the large cavern. The splendorous and awe-inspiring Pokémon flew gracefully in a small circle around the cavern, as if scanning from above whom had trespassed upon its home. As it did this, what was similar to a rain of pure, glittering, snowy light trailed out in the wake of its long, streaming tail feathers and lingered in the air behind it for a short time. Then, as it came close to making a full revolution throughout the cavern, all while being watched intently, wide-eyed and with not so much as one blink from anyone observing, the bird of legends opened its beak and let loose a sound. One that reached down into the very soul and caused all flesh to break into immediate bumps of uncontrollable excitement and fear. The shock and awe on every face was plainly detailed in every way. None more so than among Ash and his friends. In fact, their eyes were trained exclusively to the sight of the legendary bird, with their faces slack and mouths hung partly agape. I can't. Misty began, with Giselle finishing. Believe it. Brock, as well, made his own astonished attempt at speaking. It has to be a trick, there's just no way. Ash, however, was probably the one most at a loss for words. For, in all of his ways, the young man was nothing but an extremely passionate lover of all things Pokémon. Thus, seeing a legend from ancient tales soaring in the air above him, right before his very eyes, caused all manner of awestruck amazement to pass through him. In the moment of his fascination, he could only utter one word, and shakily at that. Articuno. The slew of rockets on the other side of the small island felt a similar thrill of excitement, but, for Butch and Cassidy, it was tainted by dark desire. I can't believe it, the legendary Pokémon Articuno itself. Presented right before our very eyes. Cassidy clenched her right fist and allowed a fanatical, uncontrolled gleam of selfish desire to burn hot in her eyes. We must capture it. Now is our chance. Butch, whom was still more than a little shaken up at the sight, shook his head and spoke in a tremulous reply. Right. Yeah, you heard her, boys. He called back to the amazed, though visibly intimidated rockets around them. Use your Pokémon and bring down that big ice bird. Ash's friends all finally tore their eyes from Articuno upon hearing that and gasped. Though, it was too late. Summoning what little courage they had, the men all released a second round of Pokémon. Many were identical to the ones seen at the first, though they came by different owners' hands this time around. And some were new contenders entirely, such as Hypno, Drowsy, Sandshrew, and even a Sandslash or two. As the second rank of rocket Pokémon filled the small, raised island en masse, Cassidy raised her hand and yelled. Everyone! Attack! Ash went to run forward, but he was quickly grabbed from behind at his pack by Brock, yelling in a mixture of worry and anger all at once. No! Stop! All the rocket Pokémon prepared to unleash their numerous attacks, and then, just as they locked onto the airborne Ice-type Pokémon, Articuno suddenly veered its course gracefully and began dive-bombing downward, toward the snowy platform, at unbelievably fast speeds.